Next, Leap, an Iron March anthology. An Iron March publication, 2015, version 1. Book is going to run about 230 pages. When I downloaded it online, it said the author was Alexander Slavros, but he's not mentioned here. This is the final book I have under the name of Alexander Slavros, and I've heard some good things about it, so I'm excited to get into this one. I've heard someone had told me it was his magnum opus, and I've enjoyed his work, at least the ones that I've read so far, and if there are more, I'd love to read those as well. So if you know of any, please send me the link to those. Get on with the preface here. An Iron March anthology. Fascism is a worldview like no other, as it strives for a selfless adherence to truth, and even one step out of line means failure. Thus, it is the hardest of paths to walk, especially in this day and age, when we face a constant white noise of information that obscures the truth. It took our community 4 years, and even longer still if we consider the lessons learned during its previous incarnation as the ITPF, to formulate a more clear and comprehensive understanding of the fascist worldview. And this past year, which was the Iron March year of worldview education, we have made great leaps forward in this regard, as we purposely set out to clear away all popular misconceptions and bring to everyone's attention materials that fully coincide and even further elaborate the positions of personalities that we had always held in high regard. The fruits of our work are now compiled together in this anthology book, and it's meant to be a gift to those who are only starting their journey on the fascist path, as it will help you to achieve in one reading what took us many years. However, what you will read in here is far from the full picture, but it will be enough for you to engage in our common struggle with certainty that you are in the right. What comes after is entirely up to you, whether you choose to pursue further study of the fascist worldview or not. After having read this book, you will already be informed enough to tell the truth apart from the lies, and thus you will be sure-footed on this path. What will truly matter then is how you will participate in this struggle, how you will convert your certainty into action. The process. The first task in bringing about this anthology was to select the materials to include. Only a minority of the content on Iron March is in the form of articles, the rest being exchanges of short posts. Since discussions aren't very suitable to the format of this book, we focused on the few article-type posts. We cast a wide net rather than being overly selective here, but there are still some selection criteria. 1. Time frame. The purpose of this anthology is to illustrate and crystallize the evolutionary leap that was undertaken during the year 2014 to 2015, and as such, the articles should be from this time period. Number 2, subject. The articles should be related to a worldview or theory in a general way, rather than being about news events, specific movements, or historical analysis. This whittled it down to a few dozen articles, but there was more to be done. The articles were rearranged into a coherent structure centered around themes and ordered so as to build off of one another as much as possible. The last task was to edit all the materials to make them fit a book format. This meant correcting typographical errors and cleaning up obscure grammar, but also removing references to the fact that the articles were originally forum posts. As such, each article was deforumized, so to speak. Lastly, some materials were merged if their subject were too similar and improved to better stand the test of time. Okay, Alexander Slavros is mentioned here. I just skipped over a page to see if this was a chapter 1. Chapter 1. There's more to it than your dipshit philosophy. Chapter 1. There's more to it than your dipshit philosophy. Purge the weakness. So maybe this entire book isn't written by Alexander Slavros, but I'm sure he'll be in here quite a bit. They're just referencing articles that they've chosen, that they've hand-selected here. Chapter 1. Purge the Weakness by Alexander Slavros. Let us begin by addressing misconceptions and errors we have overcome. Some of these errors were simply born from limited knowledge and understanding of fascism, which new insights have swept away. Others are the result of weakness, a lack of moral courage which characterizes moderate movements and thinkers. In our effort to teach the essence of fascism, we must whittle away everything which is false or which obscures the truth, no matter how unpopular or politically incorrect the result may appear to society at large. There's a picture here. Let me uninvert my colors. Harden the fuck up, reads. Soldier with a pistol and a gas mask, it looks like. We'll start off with some of these baby's first fascism's points and progress to the more debated themes. Third position. Time to drop this useless and pointless label. It is literally a baby's first fascism mistake in the sense that it is a concession and exists on the premise of the ideologies that have this label put on them being the third way, as opposed to communism and capitalism. First of all, fascism is broader than those two ideas put together, because it's an ideology in the case of the former and a mere economic system in the latter. As a side note, I am also hoping that few, if any, fascists still maintain the misconception that fascism is inherently capitalist. A claim made by communists and repeated by liberals to such a point that it may have very well settled in with some self-proclaimed fascists as a supposed fact. More importantly is that both communism and capitalism belong to the same world, the modern world, while fascism is essentially a representation of a different world, the traditional world. Our worldview sees only two initial spiritual paths from which everything else is derived, the solar tradition and the lunar anti-tradition. Fascism is solar, while both communism and capitalism are products of the lunar takeover. So if anything, we are the first or the original position. More on this later. Right and left. Follow-up point to the previous one. It is high time that we toss out the window this perception of right and left, as it creates nothing more than confusion on what fascism is, as well as being in part responsible for the claim of fascism being a third position, as opposed to communism and capitalism. More specifically, it is claimed that fascism has elements from both the right and the left, while those who oppose fascism gladly shove it into the camp opposite of their own. Communists will claim it right-wing, while American conservatism will view it as left-wing. The problem with the right and the left system is that it is relative. Different systems can be viewed as either right or left, depending on where you set the idea being examined. Albeit Americans managed to come up with a particularly retarded take on the right/left division and shoved communists in together with the fascists on the grounds of both being totalitarian, even though communism is clearly against the existence of a state and fascism is for the organic state. More on this later. The political division of right and left has been established in the modern world, while we maintain fascism to be a force of the traditional world, meaning that the modern perspective is more narrow and thus inadequate to categorize fascism by its standards. It also means that both these paths in the fascist worldview perception belong to the lunar anti-tradition. They can just be argued to be different stages of its takeover, a process we'll discuss further down and is called involution, with the right being the earlier stages while the left is the latter and end stages. It can be argued that we are right-wing, but only because it represents concepts that are still maintained in an earlier stage of involution and is thus closer to the origin of ideals that we value and protect. But it is still an insufficient term for what fascism actually is. Fascism and Nazism are different. This is a nice tool for red-pilling someone, an individual, into our cause. It is based on the age-old method of first deconstructing what people think in order to rebuild it in a different way later. In our case, saying fascism is something different to Nazism is a great way of opening up a dialogue in order to introduce ideas that ordinary people are not aware of and just dismiss everything as evil Nazism. Oh, so they are different? How so? Many of us came to fascism through this method ourselves. The danger is letting this idea set in before a new vision is constructed, where it is evident that fascism and Nazism are the same or that they belong to the same worldview. Fascists that get stuck in the stage of, no, see, we're fascists, not Nazis, end up on the defensive most of their time rather than driving an assault. It is a constant battle for upkeeping an image that isn't true, and liberals as a crowd know it isn't true, and will devour you the same as they do moderate nationalists. Check out Nick Griffin being chewed out on Question Time. Fascism isn't racist or anti-Semitic. This is, of course, the continuation of the previous point, an argument often made in order to deconstruct established liberal views on how fascism and Nazism are the same. They are the same, but not in the way that liberals assume. It's in parentheses. And there is enough actual material to push this idea through. Both this and the previous points are driven home by examples of policies in Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. But those are, again, manifestations of fascism as a political ideology. Policies can differ, but it doesn't make them fundamentally different in a worldview context. We can point out how Mussolini did not persecute Jews in his state. There were crucial Jewish members in the party. Mussolini even allowed fascist Jewish conferences to occur in Italy, and looked favorably to some fascist Jewish organizations which did indeed exist. For instance, the Lehi, L-E-H-I. At the same time, Italy did not share the Nazi racial doctrine. In fact, both the Nazi-esque racial manifesto and Jewish persecution only came because Hitler's Germany pushed for Italy to conform and then directly implemented those policies itself when the Salo Republic was established. However, we can likewise point to sources that prove Mussolini had desired an Italian fascist racial doctrine and realized the threat the Jews posed. But before we can present that information, we must deconstruct the old liberal-driven perception. Again, the point is that this is all well and good for the sake of red-pilling someone through deconstruction and reconstruction, but if you become hinged on the lessons of the former and don't get to the latter, you will become isolated from the reality of fascism. Take a swig. Conservative revolution. This school of thought is also fascist. It simply explored a different area of fascism, working closer to exploring fascism as a worldview. But again, it is not a separate phenomenon. It is just a different viewpoint on the same issue. In order to know the exact position of a star, one has to look at it from at least two different locations. The political movements of Europe that promoted fascist ideals take one position, while the conservative revolution school of thought explored it from another position. Ernst Junger's world of heroic realism is none other than the fascist worldview, the solar tradition. I'll highlight that. One cannot delude themselves that this is something entirely else, although it is a viable way of introducing someone to fascism as well if you initially maintain that it is something else. Yet again, it is something else if we were to look at things from the most primitive level, which is where we start deconstructing liberal notions. But once reconstruction of perception begins, it has to be made clear that they belong to the same worldview. Corporatism. This major mistake has been arguably committed to some degree even by fascist leaders. We can't know for sure, as we don't know how their visions of corporatism would have evolved from the point of conception. And it is a favorite point of criticism from liberals and communists. It is the result of purely material and economic thinking that we think of corporatism in terms of modern corporations. Original corporatism existed before any such economic formations and relations were ever established. Original corporatism can be alternatively described as guildhood. It is the idea guilds divided by vocations. Make no mistake, not jobs, not professions. Words like work, labor, and job can be traced back to origins that translate as pain, hardship, and slavery in most Aryan languages. In Russian, the core for words work, worker, slave, and slavery are exactly the same, and words labor and hardship have the same core as well, so it's more self-evident as opposed to European languages. That whole thing was in parentheses. I'll restart. Make no mistake, not jobs, not professions, but vocations. This is crucial to the hierarchical principle and the organic state that people find their proper station, what they are good at, what they were born to be, as it were. Work as a means of purely surviving, of satisfying material, physiological needs, has always been the share of the slaves, because they are enslaved by their needs, and what we have in modern socio-economics is no different. People are enslaved to jobs they hate in order to survive. What did change is the additional materialistic perception and a subsequent consumerist mindset. Working the jobs we hate to buy shit we don't need. Traditional corporations were a far cry from what we have today, as they were cults of vocations. Common activity provided a bond, and an order same way as blood and ritual provided those for higher castes that didn't engage in such activities. It is people with a certain calling gathered together in an almost religious institution that worshipped the demon, in the sense of a spiritual force rather than the Christian perception of demons, of their vocation, and a cult of the dead, i.e. heroes of said vocation that represented the ideal bond between members of the given vocation. Cults of divine, legendary patrons for each vocation. Their structure was militant, their relationship was that of an army, but their focus was in their vocation. So in a sense, the actual military is a cult of the vocation called warrior. Their members were bonded together for life, more as in a common right than on the basis of the economic interests and mere productive goals. From Julius Evola's book, Revolt Against the Modern World. The reason it is hard to say what fascist leaders pushing for a corporate state actually had in mind is because they were political reasons and had to deal with the realpolitik of their respective predicaments. Mussolini had to satisfy the interests of capitalists that supported him in a bid against a communist takeover, while Sir Oswald Mosley was facing centuries of democratic practice to mend. So it could be said that what they promoted was maybe dictated by their respective political realities, a result of their own short-sighted understanding of fascism as a worldview, which seems unlikely, judging from the described personal meeting of Julius Evola and Mussolini, where they described the conception of a fascist racial doctrine that would oppose the purely materialistic, i.e. biological Nazi one. Or perhaps what they promoted was supposed to act as an intermediate stage before traditional corporatism could be established, which seems very likely and isn't mutually exclusive to the first point. Evola dissects this issue amongst many others in terms of fascism as a practiced political doctrine in Italy in his work Fascism Viewed from the Right, where he makes definitive assessments in favor of the realpolitik plus intermediate stage argument. Whatever the case may be, modern followers of such fascist leaders who take their policies on this matter at face value and are subjected to the material socio-economic influence on perception of the modern world, coupled with constantly repeated anti-fascist mantra on what fascist corporatism supposedly is, can often fall prey to the wrong, purely socio-economic and material understanding of corporatism, and this must be overcome. Totalitarianism. Totalitarianism is not an inherently fascist ideal, but rather a stepping stone to the organic state. In fact, Evola himself had almost made this point, and I think a well-chosen quote from him would say everything required on the matter. Quote, "The traditional state is organic and not totalitarian. It is built on a hierarchical foundation and permits the existence of partial autonomy. It coordinates and brings together in the highest form of unity powers, which it, at the same time, recognizes to have freedom. Thanks to its power, it has no need for mechanical centralization, which arises only in order to subdue the formless and differentiated mass of individuals, which, however, helps to only temporarily manage the chaos, but not eliminate it once and for all. That's a quote from Fascism Viewed from the Right by Julia Savola. In this same sense, mechanical centralization can be used in the opposite direction, not so as to maintain but to build up the material framework for the existence of an organic state, as N.V. Ustryalov, Ustryalov had once said, quote, "Violence cannot help a dying idea, but it can provide immeasurable help to the rising idea," end quote. One-party system. Another misconception is thinking that fascism absolutely has to be one-party system state, when in reality fascism is against the entire democratic process that precedes the requirement of parties. Ergo, it's against parties as a formation in general, not to mention that party by definition means a part, a segment, and implies a multitude of such. So a single-party system is contradictory to the point of parties in the first place. The party was a convenient tool for the delivery of the fascist political doctrine in the modern world, but only for a short while, back when fascism was still new and the political realities were different, not to mention that informational technology didn't develop as far as it did, which was always a double-edged sword for everyone, though naturally it is the Second World War that left fascism in a hard spot for future re-emergence. Nowadays, the liberal system has fortified itself against us in entering it via the party route, and thus it is impossible to forward our ideals down that avenue with rare exceptions in some countries, namely Greece, where the Golden Dawn movement was incredibly successful. However, this should also be in large part be attributed to their direct and unapologetic rhetoric, which still disarms liberals, unlike when moderate nationalists try to enter the system by appealing to liberal sentimentalities and try to whitewash themselves of all undesirable aspects that could be targeted by liberals. Which is ridiculous, because liberals will still smell that you're not one of them and force you to constantly act on the defensive. Again, I point to Nick Griffin and the BNP. The system is rigged against us, and in the clear majority of cases, trying to enter it or appeal to it leads only to disaster. When we try to appeal to the liberal crowd, we get called out on our clearly fascist views. "So you are racists, then?" No, see, we just think whites deserve same rights. We are rights advocates." This always looks sad and pathetic, as opposed to the unapologetic and defiant stance that is befitting an actual acolyte.
Acolyte.
Oh boy, I said it right. Befitting an actual acolyte of the supreme ideals. "So you are racist, then?" "Damn straight we are, and the lot of you ought to be hung. How can you say such awful things?" "Because we stand at the edge of the abyss, and to protect what we love, we will not hesitate to eliminate those responsible." This system has long since already established methods of shaming white people for being white. You truly think you can get away with pretending to be a liberal and not get shamed for having covert fascist ideals? We can only be shamed if we allow it by hiding under rocks, away from their questions and spotlights as if confirming their truth. We cannot be shamed if our mantle is held high and for all to see, proud and defiant. In the majority of cases nowadays, entering the system via the party method is no longer viable, and the words of Corneliu Zelea Cordrianu ring even more truthfully today than they did in his own time. Quote, "The young man who joins a political party is a traitor to his generation and to his race." For My Legionaries autobiography. What fascism actually relies on is the creation of an order of the idea, which can exist as a political movement or even a party. But the latter is but a formality to enter the system, a tool, not the essence. What fascist movements had always been are warrior orders with internal militant hierarchy and discipline. The ideal vision of the fascist movement is that of a spiritual army that embodies the nature of the solar tradition and seeks the Grail, that is to say, restoration of tradition that was lost and must be found again. It is no wonder how so many fascists feel drawn to the legacy of the Templar order, which was the closest thing to this spiritual army of the Grail in human history until the emergence of fascism as a new force for restoration. reactionary or revolutionary? From reading everything that has been said up until this point, I'm sure you yourself have already felt that these terms don't entirely apply to fascism, at the very least, not in their conventional meaning. Reactionary is a term that, just like conservatism, is defined by what it is that one is reacting to or trying to conserve. But nowadays, people try to cement these notions in a very particular interpretation. It can be said that we fascists are reactionary in the sense that we are reacting to the processes of involution and decay. And yet we are revolutionary in the sense that we demand a turnaround, which is literally what revolution means, from this present status quo as dictated by the lunar anti-tradition and back to the initial state of the solar tradition. Few people question that a revolution as an event can have back and forth effects, i.e. create democracies in place of dictatorships, or to the contrary, dictatorships in place of democracies. But people like to argue about what constitutes what is revolutionary, and here the liberals, leftists, i.e. products of the involution, would like to stake a claim for themselves. That is to say that, according to them, only they can be revolutionary, while everything else is reactionary, despite, as I stated earlier, fascists seeking a turnaround back towards the solar tradition would be revolutionary compared to the established liberal system. There is also a distinct fascist take on the whole issue that further drives home the point of this word's origin. According to this perception, it is not a matter of reactionary and revolutionary, but rather revolutionary and involutionary, with fascists being the former, and you already know who constitutes the latter, while the term reactionary can apply to adherents of either side. Involution fighting against restoration via revolution is its own reaction, while as fascism fighting against decay, involution, is its reaction. In this sense, revolutionary is that which helps the process of restoration of tradition, to turn around and come back to the origin. Think of it in terms of a spinning wheel. The faster it revolves around its center, the more stable it is. The faster fascism restores tradition and stops involution, the more stable is the society of a solar tradition. Here we touch upon one of the more in-depth points that will come later, namely the cyclical vision of history that fascism upholds. Additionally, I will just mention the topic of conservatism and what it means. Again, conservatism isn't inherently fascist because it is relative. Conservatism varies from country to country depending on what it is that the conservatives are trying to conserve. In the US, conservatism is the preservation of original principles of the founding fathers, which includes small government, while in the UK, up to a point, conservatives were attempting to preserve the monarchy. And in the USSR, we had our own conservatives that attempted to stage a putsch in order to remove Gorbachev from power when he began to reform and liberalize USSR. It is possible to talk of conservatism. Alexander Stavros is Russian, then. I guess you could have figured that out by the name, but now we know it for sure. It is possible to talk of conservatism in a fascist context only in terms of the involutionary process, where conservatism works as a sort of ineffective handbrake. Society falls through from one level to a lower one in the process of involution, and conservatives attempt to maintain society on that level. However, once society falls through down another level, conservatives concern themselves with keeping society on that new level. In this sense, they are a very passive force. They try to hold the line without ever going on the counteroffensive. Fascism is thus the counteroffensive of the traditional world. I will allow George Lincoln Rockwell to summarize the fascist view on this issue. Quote, "Conservatives are sissies." End quote. Intellectualism. Let's get this point down with brutal force. Fuck language, please. Fuck intellectualism. Intellectualism shouldn't be standing anywhere near fascism in any shape or form. What we mean here by intellectualism is the circle-jerking habit of pompous, over-intellectualized analysis of things both great and inane that leads to nothing else but a never-ending dribble that is never converted to action. Fascism is a path of heroic action that doesn't negate contemplation. In fact, contemplation is one of the inherent male forms of heroism. However, it is a far cry from the phenomenon of intellectualism, which is directly tied to the process of involution. Small wonder that liberals and cultural Marxists love it, which are in essence different names we give to the same enemy, as will be shown later. The main purpose of intellectualism is deconstructive thinking, to pull at the very fabric of life until there is nothing left but a thread. They want nothing but nothingness, nothingness without end. Fascism subjected to intellectualism is the little meetings in pubs and reading of articles to a small crowd of people who are there exclusively for the mental exercise of abstract questioning that is never applied to actual life. It exists in a vacuum of its own, and, in another respect, it is preaching to a choir. It is pointless. Fascism stands as both a destructive and creative force. It doesn't deal with abstract and aimless thinking. We have too many people like this now. In fact, it was a point I made that they have created a distaste for the themes I will illuminate in my worldview articles by turning them into subjects of abstract babbling, making it appear intellectual when it is not, driving away proper fascists, isolating them to seeing fascism as merely a political ideology/doctrine, when it is so much more. This cancer has affected both teachings of tradition and the alternative look into fascism of the conservative revolutionaries, who were contemplative, not intellectual. The sooner this disease is overcome, the faster we will return to our spiritual roots, and it is essentially this issue that I am highlighting and trying to resolve with these articles and my future book. This is something I have discovered through conversations with my comrades on these topics. While not being aware of these spiritual roots, most often they don't feel there are any contradictions with anything of what they believe, but rather a newfound reinforcement of their convictions, with a few exceptions on some touchy subjects. What this shows is how, even without possessing the full context of the fascist worldview, most fascists, perhaps truer fascists, are naturally drawn to these ideals and values, meaning it's not merely some made-up ideology that one has to first study in order to support, but something that exists deeper within people, and no wonder, seeing how the solar tradition is something that is inherent to our nature. There's an image of a tiger here. I believe that's the end of the first chapter. Go back up. Oh man, that's not the end of the first chapter. The chapters are divided up into a few articles. So. Okay, back to page 20. Come home, fascists, come home. Okay. Come home, fascists, come home, by Alexander Slavros. What is fascism? So this is an entirely new article. What is fascism? Unfortunately, the questions don't yet have an answer that would be as precise as, for instance, the answer to what is Marxism. It's not that there is no direct answer, it is just that nobody ever gave the answer. So far, all answers have been insufficient in the sense that they often only illuminate a particular side of fascism, or, in worst case scenario, the answer is written up by anti-fascists who haven't gotten a clue about our deeper roots. They only care about fascism and how it is opposed to what they stand for. The definitions of fascism produced by Marxists, capitalists, and liberals will focus on what is so dear to them that fascism opposes. It doesn't really matter to them what fascism is beyond that. It already qualifies as the enemy and must be stopped. Picture here of let me uninvert my colors. So it's a white person in shades, got a hood up, and he seems to be marching with some sort of crowd. Says, "Fucking fascisms, how do they work?" However, because there is no direct answer and there's an abundance of simple subjective pseudo-definitions for what is fascism and what it stands for, many self-proclaimed fascists build up their understanding of it from these definitions made by our enemies. Yes, some actually do read the works of prominent fascists. However, here we meet the issue of visualizing fascism only in a particular light, in the light of political activism. Not to say that this is bad in the slightest, however, it is not enough. It is simply not the full story. Fascism in the context of a political ideology is but an aspect of a much broader context of fascism as a worldview, and reading prominent fascist political figures and movement leaders gives more to understanding of the former, rather than the latter. What gives their writings perspective is reading the works of people who had explored fascism as a worldview. Here, another problem arises. The people who got to reading the works of such people, a prominent name would be Julius Evola, had typically been wannabe intellectuals and self-proclaimed philosophers who rarely engage in any sort of actual fascist action. These swines managed to create a general distaste for this field of knowledge amongst the fascists who are thus far isolated in the context of political ideology. Worse still, these intellectuals do not even fully comprehending, it reads, the subject matter that they absolutely adore to espouse complete nonsense about in their little academic circle jerks where they stroke their own egos and jack each other off, complimenting themselves on being intellectual. These are the euphoric fedora-wearing imbeciles of the fascist world, who had rightfully earned themselves the title of Evola fags, which shouldn't be taken as a slight against Julius Evola, who would have trashed these vermin himself. In fact, he did. Block quote here. Representatives of this sort of intellectualism value the brilliant phrase and effective wielding of polemics and dialectics far more than the truth. They use ideas as an excuse. It's important for them to shine, to give the impression of a particularly smart person, same as contemporary politicians use party ideology exclusively for the purpose of advancing personal gains. It is a real market of vanity, where the worst kind of subjectivism rules, often accompanied by honest narcissism, which becomes increasingly evident when these gangs of intellectuals attain secular gloss, for instance in all sorts of literary clubs and cultural groups. Without a doubt, there is a measure of truth in the words of whomever said that, amongst all the varieties of idiocy, the most disgusting idiocy is that of the intellectuals. It's from The Bow and the Club, by Julius Evola. Evola also expressed dislike for philosophers at large as being people who just like to muse aimlessly. Because the field of understanding fascism as a worldview is occupied by such faggots, normal fascists avoid these texts for being mystical dribble, because that is the impression that the Evola fags had given these concepts. The reality of the matter is that in these texts one can find the spiritual roots of fascism, and that opens up a new perspective on the struggle that we are engaged in, not only lifting the veil on what is fascism, but also giving new insight into the forces that we oppose. I say that these teachings hold spiritual roots of fascism with certainty because they rarely come into conflict with what fascists think in the context of a political ideology, but rather expands their horizons and gives new context to what was already well established. There is no issue of reconciliation except for a few points that in the end still don't contradict what fascists, as political activists, already adhere to. One such minor point, for example, can be best described by looking at Evola's criticism of fascism from the right, which can be viewed as criticism of fascism as an ideologically driven political practice, in Italy specifically, from the view of fascism as a worldview. One of Evola's points can be summed up as Italian fascism going down the path of other ideologies and political practices that are materialistic. Namely, he speaks out against the Italian totalitarian structure as being the mechanical anti-vision of the organic state. He even traces totalitarianism to being at its core a liberal phenomenon. The more primitive explanation of that would be, people shouldn't be forced to conform and monitored for deviation. They have to adhere to the vision willingly because they have found their place in it. In the same sense, one can criticize Hitler for utilizing communist tactics based around zero compromise and the use of violence, something Hitler justified as fighting fire with fire. Another image here. A picture of Evola says, "Write that fascism wasn't right enough. Confuse liberals and rightists." I think it's supposed to be read more like, "Write that fascism wasn't right enough. Confuse liberals and rightists." Like one of those old Doge memes. Similar. However, the practice established by all fascist leaders is not wrong, and can be reconciled with the broader understanding of fascism as a worldview, if you understand it to be a broader practice of what Evola explained as riding the tiger. Ride the tiger is essentially the concept of using the opponent's force against himself, but Evola goes on about it as the individual practice for the sake of survival of a lone man of tradition in a whirlwind of modern decay. But if you apply this practice not to an individual but a group, then you have the establishment of fascism as a political ideology that is centered around fascist action. We play by the rules of modernity, but only so that we can take over and then gradually move to a state of being where these rules no longer apply. Thus, fascism needs to use totalitarianism only until such a point when it would be redundant, until a new generation has been groomed to believe in the values that would define our society and then practice them willingly by default. Then there will be no more need for a totalitarian system and will be one step closer to the realization of the organic state. The only danger in this practice is not to fall prey to the materialist thinking of the enemy. That is to say, not to get sucked into the whirlwind of modernity. Just have a look at Nick Griffin and the BNP or any moderate nationalist, for example. We live in the modern world. Our options are fairly limited in how we can handle our situation. Evola lists 3 specific paths in one of his earliest works: heathen imperialism, the individual path of spiritual isolation or separation from the modern world in order to survive it, be as a stone in a river, unmovable by it. This is the survival of the aristocrat by the soul. Example, godfather of fascism, Ernst Jünger, whom Armin Mohler described as a representative of the fascist style. The path of purposely accelerating the degeneration of the modern world in order to help it die faster and thus make way for a new traditional world. Example, Futurism would serve as a good example of the organized movement for this path, as they promoted many of the progressive, modernist aspects, with a distinct taste for action that would end with cleaning the slate of civilization as we know it, thus making way for new tradition. Finally, the path of conscious protest, of merciless, destructive, and creative force in order to overcome the modern world and restore tradition in our time. Fascism as a political ideology falls into the last path, the path of revolting against the modern world with force, the quest for the grail, restoration, coming back to the source, what Armin Mohler described as Nazi passion. This is the path of all organized fascist/Nazi movements. As I have stated earlier in this article, for the most part, modern fascist activists are already doing things right, but they are doing it without the broader, deeper context of their actions that would give understanding of not only what it is we fight for at this time, but also of what it is that comes after our victory. And it is in our interest if this context could be delivered in a concise, comprehensive way. It can't be expected for every single fascist to read all these books and essentially conduct the same research that I am engaged in order to gain insight into the fascist worldview. Thus a single tome is required and that is what I plan to produce. Many of the points I make in this article will be repeated in the book, but naturally with more insight. For now, consider this article to be a glimpse of what I am working on, and even more so an early call for fascists to come home. What is Fascism? By Zeiger. Zeiger. It was said before that no good definition of fascism exists as of now, since all definitions are either created by our enemies, who are more concerned with their disagreements with us than our real ideas, or are tied to specific movements or time periods. I want to remedy this by painting a broad picture of fascism, stripped of its historical baggage and negative characterizations. Fascism isn't X or Y, in parentheses. Ideology versus worldview. First of all, we often say that fascism isn't an ideology but a worldview. What is the difference? When a man is on a journey, he needs a few things to ensure he'll have a good trip. He first of all needs to know where he wants to go, to have some idea of his destination. Even if it's just a feeling, go where it's warmer, or a vague direction, east. He'll also need maps, which contain the knowledge that will get him to his destination. In life, a man's destination is determined by his values, and he makes tactical decisions on a day-to-day basis according to his knowledge or ideas, which are like his map to reality. Similarly, groups of people who are headed in the same direction share a common worldview, and they base their policies on an ideology. In other words, a group's worldview is the system of values by which they judge everything else and decide what their common goals are, while ideologies are the theories and models they develop to reach those goals. Destination equals value system, or individuals, which equals worldview, or groups. Maps equal ideas, or individuals, which equal ideology, or groups. Modernism versus traditionalism. So we know that fascism is a worldview, which is to say a system of values used to judge and understand the world. Now, we must determine what kind of worldview it is. There's basically infinite numbers of potential ideologies and worldviews, but they all belong to one of two categories, which are polar opposites and totally irreconcilable. Those two categories are modernism, often called materialism, and traditionalism, often called idealism. In modernism, the highest good is to be comfortable and safe, while avoiding pain and danger. Everything is good or bad according to that criteria. In traditionalism, the highest good is truth and the rejection of falsehoods. Everything is good or bad according to that criteria. It's very important to note that for modernists, ideas, values, and theories are tools to be used to attain material ends. Those things have no inherent value in themselves. If truth is in the way of feeling good, then truth must go. Inversely, for traditionalism, it is material conditions and possessions that are considered tools, used for the purpose of attaining and upholding truth. If comfort and safety are in the way of truth, those things must be sacrificed. What is fascism? Fascism is the embodiment of the traditional worldview, as it manifests in the modern world. This means fascism is primarily concerned with truth, which is to say, with objective reality. It also means that while fascism is not an ideology, fascists can employ ideologies to deal with specific circumstances when the need arises. Fascism cannot be compared with ideologies like capitalism or communism, since those are simply alternate methods to reach the same goal, i.e. the greatest comfort and safety for the greatest numbers, while fascism holds a completely different goal, to make human society embody the eternal truths of the universe. Of course, since the world is a complex and mysterious place, which no one can claim to fully understand, implicit in the fascist worldview is the need to explore and experiment in order to attain a greater knowledge of the truth, which will be reflected in our laws and institutions. Inversely, the purpose of science in the modern worldview is to create gadgets for our pleasure and convenience, while uncomfortable findings are swept under the rug to allow liberal myths to go unchallenged. Tenets of fascism. Ideologies like libertarianism are full of tenets, ideas that define them. For example, libertarians insist that since everyone is selfish, giving anyone a monopoly will lead to corruption. That is one of their tenets. By making a simple list of these tenets, it's possible to explain what the ideology is about quickly and easily. This is not possible with fascism, because fascism has no tenets. Indeed, fascists tend to be racist, socialist, anti-Semites, and many other things. But those are not inherent components of fascism or inherent personality traits of fascists. After all, we must remember that at some point in history, liberals were also racist. Communists also believe in socialist policies. And conservatives also were anti-Semitic. Such details cannot define the essence of our worldview. A fascist simply looks at the evidence and decides that reality is racist. Human nature is that we are social animals, and Jews have historically been a harmful influence on every society that hosted them. If it was proven the other way around, a fascist would adopt the opposite notion. As such, fascism has no hard and fast tenets, but fascists are accumulating a mass of scientific and academic evidence that is politically incorrect for modern materialist society. As individuals grow and progress on the path of fascism, they will progressively acquaint themselves with this body of evidence and thus approach truth. Also, basic common sense and a cursory observation of nature will let anyone understand certain principles that govern the world. The strong survive while the weak perish. Such a banal, give me a sec. Banal. Cool. Such a banal notion that it barely needs saying, yet a revolutionary thing to affirm to a modernist. All of these simple principles can be learned by reading or remembering the fables of Aesop's fables. Short stories written thousands of years ago and intended to teach common sense to children, yet which are now terribly politically incorrect. Are they really? You know, I've heard things about Barnes & Noble's classics and Penguin classics and such, revising books like Ernst Junger's Storm and Steel. I believe that was by Ernst Junger. Storm and Steel, I know for sure, because I was checking it out on Amazon. And the only thing I could find was like a Penguin classic or an not Amazon, Barnes & Noble classic or whatever. And I had, a lot of the reviews had said it was totally different from the original work. And I'm wondering if that's the Aesop's fables that I read. If it's hard to say, you know. Because I have a Barnes & Noble classic, Aesop's Fables, and my girlfriend read it, and I don't remember anything about it being politically incorrect. But don't buy from Barnes & Noble or any of those Penguin classics. It's something I learned pretty recently, actually. Anyways, walking on the path of truth. Being a fascist means walking on the path of truth, and this requires a weeding out of all falsehoods from our lives. This begins with the self. It is necessary to fully accept who and what we are, unlike the degenerates who reject their humanity, reject their gender, reject their race, their nation, their history, etc. As Rockwell said, you either believe in the scientific method and apply it to yourself, or you're only kidding yourself. Walking on the path of truth means learning what is our place in the world and fulfilling that position. It means understanding that everything from individuals to nations, races, and species have their place in a cosmic hierarchy. This holds true even when we're faced with the uncomfortable notion that we're not at the top of that hierarchy. When the social order reflects the natural order, which is to say that every member of society fulfills the role that is most appropriate to their nature, then that society has realized the fascist ideal. And Okay, I think this next one's only a couple pages. I'm going to try and muscle through it. Next leap. Next leap. Oh man. I think I'm going to go ahead and call it quits there. That'll do it for part 1. Thanks.